This video is the third in a series covering my experience of the Precure franchise. It'd be a good idea to go and watch the previous two videos before watching this one, but given that the season covered in this video works as a standalone series, that may not be entirely necessary. The decision is yours. Futari wa Precure Splash Star is the third season of the Precure franchise, and thus far it is my favorite of the bunch. There are so many little improvements from the previous seasons that make this one more enjoyable, though at a glance it looks like the exact same show, and in a few annoying aspects, it is. But there's also one really big aspect that I think makes the whole show worth watching, and that's what I want to focus on right now. To that end, I'll be splitting this video into sections. The one really important thing, and the less important things. Part 1, the one important thing that's really good. By far the strongest elements of this season, the elements that alone make this season worth watching and put it above the other two seasons, are the characters of Michiru and Kaoru. These two are the best villains the series has ever produced, and possibly the overall most developed and well-rounded characters, due in no small part to the fact that they don't stay villains. They start the series firmly on the dark side. They infiltrate the school of Saki and Mai, those are our two new main characters by the way, with the goal of getting close to them so as to catch them off guard and defeat them for the benefit of the bad guys. The initial plan sounds like a tired plot that's been done before, and it is, we'll get to that. But in this season it works, and it all comes down to how Michiru and Kaoru are portrayed. From the get-go, their facial expressions and mannerisms are some of the most deadpan things I've ever seen. Their seeming lack of caring at the start is so absurd and over the top that it's fun to watch. What's more fun though is watching how they come to realize that yes, they do care. To no one's surprise, least of all my own, over the course of their infiltration, Michiru and Kaoru slowly come to the realization that the fake friendship they thought they had with Saki and Mai is actually real, and that they care about their friends and don't want to see them come to harm. To me, this sort of development is inherently interesting, but what sells it is the slow build-up and the details in that build-up. The bond between Precure and Michiru and Kaoru isn't something that just happens overnight. It's slowly developed over the course of several episodes. When they're first introduced, they seem apathetic toward everything. They only go along to a study session at Saki's place so as to not seem suspicious, or to potentially attack Precure. But when they get there and Saki's kid sister asks Kaoru about something, she gives the kid rather helpful advice and soon realizes how weird it is that she did that. She even saves the kid later on from the attacks of one of her fellow villains, which triggers a sort of existential crisis in the two. From then on, they have to question all of their actions and motivations, all while dealing with Saki and Mai being the friendliest of friends around. This is all the external representation of the internal conflict in Michiru and Kaoru that makes them so interesting. They feel a loyalty to the bad guys, the side that gave them life, but as they see more examples of how cool friendship is and how much it would suck to get rid of it, they're forced to debate with themselves. They have to choose between their family and the greater good. They of course know the right answer, it's just that the right answer pains them. This internal conflict of theirs was the most intriguing part of the first half of the show, and satisfying to see through to its heart-wrenching conclusion. And when you get down to it, the reason why is pretty simple. It's the most interesting part of the show because it's the most complicated conflict in the series thus far. The conflicts in the series up until Splash Star have been, for the most part, fairly black and white. It boils down mostly to good versus evil, and while that's easy for the kids to understand and makes a flurry of punches to the bad guy's gullet uber satisfying, it doesn't make for much to think about. Michiru and Kaoru, unlike the rest of the villains in the series, provide internal conflict and intrigue by deliberating over a problem whose correct answer pains them. Also, unlike the rest of the villains, by acting on that correct answer and changing sides, they develop as characters, giving them a depth that even the Precures up until now have lacked. It's their actions at the end of the series that provide the satisfying payoff for their arc. Up until the last 7 episodes, they're held hostage by the bad guys for their betrayal, but once they've been rescued, 1, the reunion between them and Precure is cute and super heartwarming, but more importantly, 2, they follow through on their realizations that the bad guys they were loyal to are bad and that Precure is good, and join forces with Precure to fight and save the world. Holy shit, thank you show, you are great. There's almost no logic as to why this development brings me so much joy. Up until this point, it's been over 100 episodes of the same formula repeated over and over. The two Precures fight some monster, shoot a big laser at it, and that's the day. Maybe an awkward third wheel helps sometimes. Now the formula's changed. Not terribly much, mind you, but enough to make me excited. The fights where the four team up manage to generate excitement not only because it's a break from formula, but also because they're visual representations of how much the bond between the group has developed. They're not fighting random monsters anymore, but the generals of the bad guy team, in pairs. Previous fights with enemy generals have always been one at a time, so two at a time is an immense challenge, one Precure might not have been able to overcome on their own. It's because they've become such good friends with Michiru and Kaoru, and because those two have developed into better people, that they're able to fight so well together, and overcome impossible odds. The bond between the four develops more and more with each fight. The finale rolls around and their friendship has gotten so strong that in a moment of grand stakes and huge emotions, Michiru and Kaoru essentially become their own Precures. After watching the bond between the four grow over the whole rest of the show, having it all come to a head in that one moment filled me with so much joy and hype that a stupid smile was plastered on my face for the rest of the episode. Michiru and Kaoru's growth into rounded, independent people is also helped along by not being just about Precure and friendship. The two are shown to have cares of their own that developed independent of everything else. Before they entered Precure's world, their job was guarding the one they helped ruin. It was a desolate place. No trees, no blue sky, no life, only ruin. While they were there, they had to lie to themselves that they were happy, that this was right, in order not to go crazy. That illusion that they had built for themselves, that the ruin around them was at all acceptable, was shattered when they entered Precure's world, and saw the majesty of it all. Brilliant green trees surrounding an endless sparkling ocean, birds singing in the morning sun. They realized, all on their own, that they cared about that kind of beauty, that they didn't want to bring it all to ruin. That this development occurred independent of their feelings for Precure is what makes it so interesting, and what makes them seem more rounded. If they had turned into good guys only because friendship is magic, it would have come off as way too simple, like the show was shoving down the viewer's throat its pro-friendship agenda, without bothering to make it feel right for the characters. Instead, since Michiru and Kaoru have their own wants and desires independent from Saki and Mai, they get to be rounded characters with their own motivations for betraying the bad guys besides just friendship. If anything about Michiru and Kaoru's story sounds familiar, that's because it is recycled from the first season. It too had a villain who started attending school with the goal of befriending Precure, only to end up actually caring about and helping them. The major difference between these two versions of that story, and the reason why Splash Star did it so much better, is simply a matter of quantity. In Season 1, the villain who would turn good, whose name I can't remember, showed up about halfway through the first arc and was out of the show before its halfway mark. His only other appearance was a brief one at the very end of the series, nearly 30 episodes later. He just isn't around all that much. He sticks around barely long enough to make an emotional impact on the characters and then leaves before his name can stick in the viewer's memory. It's hard to think of him as very important when the show seems intent to shove him out of the way as quick as it does. Michiru and Kaoru, by contrast, once they show up in episode 14, are a presence with a constant effect on the goings-on of things, even for the 17 episodes when they're absent between their apparent deaths and return. When they're first on the scene, it's fun to watch the simple, if underplayed friendship growing between them and Saki and Mai. While they're gone, their absence is a constant motivating force for Precure to strive forward in order to recover them, and once they're back, they team up to kick some bad guy ass together. That's much more than can be said of the other guy, who disappears and is almost never mentioned again until he shows up briefly just to remind the viewer that he existed at all. With Michiru and Kaoru, you see a bond form and grow over the course of the whole show, which is a whole lot more engaging than the little provided by the other guy. Basically, Michiru and Kaoru make this whole season worth watching. There's a depth to them that hasn't been reached by any previous villain, really any other character, in the rest of the show. Unfortunately, the show is not just about them. Part 2. The less important things that are bad. The main characters for this season, though they bear more than a striking resemblance to Nagisa and Honoka from the last seasons, are not in fact them. They're two new characters, Saki and Mai, and while they're undeniably likable characters, they bear too many similarities to their previous season counterparts, both physically and otherwise. Saki, like Nagisa before her, has medium, short, orangish hair, is clumsy and academically challenged, and excels at sports, eventually becoming the captain of her team. Mai, like Honoka, is the more intellectually adept of the two, but not nearly as outspoken as her partner. There are several differences here and there, like how Saki's family runs a bakery instead of Nagisa's dad being the sole breadwinner, or how Mai isn't into general science but loves to draw, but these differences seem ultimately minute in the face of all the similarities. It's to the point that I have to wonder why they bothered making new characters in the first place if the new characters were going to be so similar to the previous ones. Perhaps after nearly 100 episodes with Nagisa and Honoka, the idea was to ease the audience into the idea of switching out the main cast. The following seasons, from what I can tell, seem to have casts much more varied than what we're presented with in Splash Star. Throwing the audience, familiar with and expecting old characters, straight into the action with outright new characters would have been jarring, so presenting them first with new yet familiar characters instead might have helped ease the transition. Of course, I'm just spitballing here, and regardless of the reasoning behind it, I found myself distracted in the early episodes by just how similar Saki and Mai were to Nagisa and Honoka. Over the course of 49 episodes in a movie, I stopped noticing the similarities as much and got used to Saki and Mai being the main characters, but I don't think that's a result of them becoming much different from their predecessors as much as it was me settling into the season's rhythm. The only other major negative thing I can say is that quite a few episodes between the season's surprisingly interesting plot-heavy episodes are very repetitive, containing only generic slice-of-life bits with samey Monster of the Week battles and little in the way of character growth or plot progression to tide me over. Episode 28, for example, the most memorable things that happen are the characters get on a train and then they fight in the cave. Nothing else of note happens the whole episode. They fight the Monster of the Week and that's it. No interesting character drama, no plot progression, nothing, and that can be said of a few too many episodes. Luckily, that's all the bad I have to say, and the rest is mostly good. Part 3, the less important things that are good. Thankfully, Michiru and Kaoru aren't the only good parts of this season. There are other smaller elements in the show that together go a long way toward making it more memorable and to separate it from its predecessors. The new setting, that of a small beachside town, is something I greatly appreciated. The previous 2 seasons were set in generic Japanese suburbia. Dad commutes to the city to work, kids go to the local school, and there's nothing of note. The small beachside town of Splash Star, by contrast, is more memorable on a base level, and a lot of detail sprinkled in throughout the show helped to cement it as a believable location in my mind. There was no shortage of wide shots showing the surrounding roads along the hill capped by the all-important Sky Tree, just a couple of minutes' drive from the beach. All the stairs and downhill roads leading toward the water and the lack of any buildings taller than 2 or 3 stories sold the town as being small and carefully perched on the hill-laden beachside. On top of that, they managed to briefly weave the setting into the show's plot. In the previous seasons, where the main characters were was incidental. What mattered was what was happening. That's still mostly true this season, but near the end, they tie in the setting to play a significant role in the plot. The villains spend the vast majority of the show searching for the Fountain of Sun, because destroying that is key to destroying the world or whatever, and at episode 48 it's revealed that, surprise, the ocean they've been living next to is that fountain. I liked this turn of events because it made the setting feel important, like they weren't made to live near the beach just for the sake of having a cool backdrop for whatever scene, but they were there because that setting, that ocean, was significant to the progression of the show, and indeed it does lead to an oh shit moment of hopelessness during the finale. Splash Star also features a much improved, wider-ranging support cast. The only supporting cast member I remember having any sort of importance from the previous 2 seasons was Akane, who acted as a moral guide, fun companion, and a guardian to Hikari when she came around. She was cool, but the rest of the supporting cast... This time around, the supporting cast made a larger impression. The classmates of the main characters have more going on. Of particular note is the one boy who aspires to be a comedian. He makes a bunch of Japanese puns that I struggled to follow but still cracked a smile at, and over the course of the show forms a comedy duo with a reluctant classmate, and they end up developing a solid act. The families of Saki and Mai also have more presence. In the previous seasons, Honoka's family was just not around, and the only notable thing about Nagisa'S family was that her dad was Dio for some reason, and he cracked dad jokes. Which sounds nice, but they're around so little that it's easy to forget about. In Splash Star, though, Mai's mother is an archaeologist whose work ethic is an inspiration to her daughter, and Mai's dad is a university professor. Saki's parents run a bakery that she's always helping out in, from which she learns the value of working hard, along with plot occasionally developing in said bakery. Unlike previous seasons, the families of the main cast have a noticeable effect on their behavior, which makes the families loads more interesting and important and fun to watch this time around. Speaking of supporting cast, the villains this time around are much more memorable. Previous seasons featured several casts of bland villains that fail to stick to memory due to them lacking any sort of personality or motivation aside from be bad. Excepting the one kid who was outdone in every conceivable manner by Michiru and Kaoru, I can't remember any of their names. Have a hard time picturing their faces, and can't tell you anything about them other than they existed. In Splash Star, each villain is thankfully much more memorable. Fun foes to root against. The first one is the worst of the bunch, just an angry guy made out of leaves, but at least he has that visual theme of leaves, unlike the previous villains who just looked weird. They get better from there. One of them is this flamboyant guy who spouts off random Spanish words at every turn. Señorita! I cannot tell if that's racist or just... I don't know, but whatever this guy is, he's highly amusing. He prances about the screen, stealing the show whenever he shows up, never failing to be a riot. Then there's this one yellow mole guy who sounds so much like Fred Burger from The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy that I get weirded out every time I hear him. What? There's this high-strung, self-absorbed lady who controls water, who one time helps Precure beat one of her allies out of spite for that ally, hammering home how self-centered and vain she is, which is much deeper characterization than any previous villain. There's a golden muscle man who's all about honor. Where other villains will interrupt Saki and Mai in the middle of them doing something important, this guy will wait for them to finish, and then request to fight on a private battlefield instead of risking public exposure. He even at one point gives Saki some friendly and helpful advice on a drawing she's working on because he's just that cool a dude. Where previous villains just fight Precure mindlessly out of nowhere, Golden Muscle Man prioritized honor and civility, making him much more interesting of a foe. And yes, that is a JoJo reference. The best stunt Splash Star pulls with its villains happens during the finale. The majority of the series sets up this giant samurai guy, Akudai Khan-sama, as being the big bad, and does quite a good job of it. Due to his size and deep voice, not to mention power levels, he's a menacing presence. As the end closes in, he starts duking it out in epic fashion with Precure and Michiru and Kaoru, and just as the fight seems to be coming to a head, surprise, Akudai Khan was a sham the whole time. Turns out this tiny little henchman guy who's just been around, mocking the rest of the villains, was the real big bad all along. For me, this was an effective twist because I did not see it coming, but I also didn't feel like it was an ass pull. The show hinted at the real big bad's power throughout its run, but always made sure not to play it up. So by the time the reveal came along, I wasn't thinking, what, are you kidding me? But oh, I get it now. All around, Splash Star is a stronger iteration on its previous incarnations. Its characters are overall stronger, mostly due to Michiru and Kaoru, but the show is also better presented. It better fleshes out its setting, and in some places it just looks really nice. It isn't without its faults. The previous season's repetitiveness didn't go anywhere, but the faults aren't as pronounced this time around. It's a more enjoyable experience that I would recommend to any fan of the magical girl genre, and I would recommend it over the previous 2 seasons. Oh, and there's also a movie. Part 4, the very unimportant movie. The Splash Star movie is... it's fine, I guess. Like the last 2 movies, it's essentially an extended episode, but thanks to the perplexing lack of Michiru and Kaoru and a completely different supporting cast, it's much less interesting than the series it's based on. The best I could say for it is that it looks nice. Being able to watch a Blu-ray version of Precure fresh in the middle of a DVD-only series is certainly nice, though the art style remains unchanged. It has some of the series' sweetest fight animation, which is the sole reason to watch the movie for how cool it is, especially since the villain Precure fights this time around look straight out of Bloodborne. But other than that, the rest of the movie ranges from dull to unpleasant. Like the last movie, Saki and Mai get into an argument that ends up temporarily hampering their friendship and ability to fight, but unlike the last movie, it presents the worst possible version of this story. In the last movie, their separation stemmed from an issue that had come up before, so it was a little more believable. Not to mention, they realized how dumb their squabble was early on, and the main conflict between the two, aside from being brainwashed into fighting each other, was just getting over their embarrassment and confessing to each other how dumb they felt. This time around, their argument stems from a tiny event that really should be completely inconsequential. Stupider things have happened between them in the series, and the argumentative dialogue the two exchange is dragged out and downright unpleasant. Their fight doesn't make for an interesting viewing experience, just painful. So overall, the movie has some of the best fighting, but the worst characterization, so I can only recommend it if you really liked the series. Otherwise, just skim it for the action scenes. And that's it. That is a series that's overall an improvement over its predecessors and more fun to watch, and a movie that's just Upon finishing Splash Star, I found myself much more satisfied with the season than I was with the previous 2, and I hope this improvement in quality between seasons proves to be a trend. Thanks for sticking with me through my rambling about a children's magical cartoon show. I hope you'll leave your thoughts in the comments. Believe it or not, I really do get a kick out of those. Next up in the series is, yes, Precure 5. Odd name, considering it's the 4th season, but hey, the show's finally gone widescreen in HD, so that's gonna be nice. I hope you'll join me next time. See ya then.